I stared at my phone like it had suddenly sprouted teeth. The screen glared at me with a message that felt like a punch to the gut. "You're banned from Thanksgiving, idiot." Just those 8 words, typed by my own mother, carried years of disdain, neglect, and favoritism compressed into a single brutal sentence. My fingers hovered over the screen, wanting to reply, wanting to scream, wanting to make her understand. But the truth was, she never would. Every holiday, every family gathering, every carefully wrapped gift I gave had been dismissed or overshadowed by my siblings, by the golden child, and somehow I was always left with crumbs, emotionally, financially, socially. I remembered past Thanksgivings, the way she would praise my sister for a simple pie or compliment my brother for a casual joke, while ignoring the hours I spent decorating, cooking, or just trying to be present. That pattern had followed me from childhood to adulthood, a constant reminder that in her eyes, I was invisible, expendable, and now the text confirmed it in the harshest possible way. Not only invisible, but actively unwelcome. The humiliation clawed at me as I scrolled back through old messages, pictures, and memories, looking for evidence that I had ever mattered. Each screenshot, each well-intentioned message I had sent over the years, felt like it had been floating into a void. The rage bubbled up, but so did the ache of repeated rejection, the subtle but constant reminder that I was always second best, always overlooked, always dismissed. Yet beneath the anger, a strange clarity began to settle in. If they saw me as powerless, if they thought I would crumble under their neglect, maybe it was time they realized I had been underestimated all along. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to beg for acceptance, to apologize for existing, or to defend my worth. The text, as cruel as it was, had lit a fire inside me, and that fire wasn't going out anytime soon. By the time I managed to set my phone down, it was buzzing relentlessly, an endless cascade of notifications that refused to stop. 87 missed calls, just from my mom, aunt, and siblings. 87 tiny nails hammered into the coffin of my patience. Each call felt like a reminder that I was expected to drop everything and apologize for existing, to bend and bow to their whims as if my life had no meaning outside of their approval. I sat back in my chair, scrolling through the missed calls, letting the weight of the past press against me. I remembered the birthdays I spent alone, while my siblings received elaborate parties, the holidays I organized in silence, and the countless times I had lent money, helped with projects, or stayed late to support their needs while receiving nothing but a fleeting thanks or a passing glance. I thought about every Thanksgiving where I cooked the turkey, set the table, and kept the house immaculate while they praised each other and ignored me entirely. The repetition was maddening, a cycle that had etched itself into my bones, leaving me tired, small, and invisible. And yet, beneath the frustration and humiliation, a strange realization emerged. These calls, this storm of frantic voices, were all fuel. They were reminders of what I had endured, and what I was finally prepared to confront. For once, I didn't feel like the powerless child I had been. I felt like someone who had been underestimated for far too long. Every missed call, every unanswered text, every attempt to guilt me into submission only reminded me that I was ready to reclaim control on my terms. As I sat there, phone silent in my hand, memories began to flood back, uninvited but impossible to ignore. I could see it all so clearly, the way my mother would gush over my sister for the smallest achievements, the way my brother's jokes were laughed at while mine were met with silence or eye rolls. I remembered the 5th grade science fair when I spent weeks crafting a model that worked flawlessly, only for my mother to forget to attend, while my sister's mediocre project earned ribbons and admiration. I remembered high school graduations, birthdays, recitals, family dinners, every instance where I tried to contribute, to be noticed, to matter, and how my efforts were dismissed as if I were invisible. The humiliation wasn't just subtle, It was public. I could feel the sting of those moments again, like tiny needles pressed against my heart. And now, this latest text, this explicit rejection, was the culmination of years of being the family doormat. Something inside me snapped. I realized I was done bending, done apologizing for existing, done shrinking myself to fit their mold of who they wanted me to be. The tears and anger tangled together, a mix of grief for what I had lost, and rage at the injustice of it all. For the first time, I could see a path forward, not one that begged for approval, not one that tolerated humiliation, but one where I could stand tall and reclaim the power they had always denied me. My mind raced with possibilities, with small ways to strike back, to assert myself, to ensure that the world they had ignored would finally take notice of me. The tension coiled inside me like a spring ready to release, a sense of anticipation for what I was about to do that was both terrifying and exhilarating. I was no longer the scared, overlooked child. I was someone who was about to rewrite the rules of engagement, and nothing would be the same after this moment. I took a deep breath, letting the adrenaline settle into a sharp clarity. Enough was enough. For years I had been footing the bills, covering shared expenses, bailing out family members who never thanked me and often mocked my efforts. I opened my laptop and began systematically cutting off every utility, subscription, and financial link connected to my name. Electricity, water, internet, the cable account. They all went dark in a carefully orchestrated sequence. Each cancellation felt like a small but potent act of liberation, a reclaiming of power I had been denied for decades. I imagined their confusion, the frustration building as they tried to access accounts, only to find the keys I had held were gone. I paused for a moment, savoring the thought of them finally experiencing a fraction of the disruption and helplessness I had endured silently for so long. Emails began bouncing back, automated notifications rolling into my inbox as proof that my plan was working. The satisfaction was immediate but tempered with anticipation. I knew the real impact would come when they realized it wasn't a mistake, that I had intentionally removed their safety net. My stomach twisted with excitement and fear. I was venturing into uncharted territory, but it was mine to command. Every alert, every failed payment, every panicked call that would soon follow became a drumbeat for the revenge that was just beginning. And somewhere deep inside, a wicked thrill took root as I imagined their faces when they discovered what I had done. This was only the first move, but the board was set, and the game had officially begun. The first responses were almost laughable, passive-aggressive, clipped, the kind of messages people send when they're trying not to look panicked. "Did you change the Wi-Fi password again?" my sister texted, an accusation wrapped in a gif of a shrugging cat. My aunt sent a string of emojis and then, in plain text, "Is everything okay?" The water bill didn't go through. My phone filled with short, probing questions, thinly veiled attempts to guilt me into fixing what I'd done. There was a rhythm to it all, a cadence I recognized from years of being the one who smoothed things over while other people carried on. When I replied, I kept my words spare and deliberately neutral. "Not right now," I wrote to my sister. "I'll look later," I told my aunt. That calm, measured tone drove them crazier than any temper tantrum I might have thrown. They wanted panic. They wanted me to beg. They wanted the old me, the automatic helper who smoothed things over so no one had to face consequences. Instead, they met silence and a refusal to be the family's safety valve. In person, the ripples showed as awkwardness. At a family lunch, my brother skimmed over a conversation, watching me like someone trying to see if a crack would give. My cousin, whom I'd bailed out of rent twice, made a joke about being tech-challenged and laughed too loudly. My mother spoke to me with that practiced blend of concern and superiority, the same tone she used when correcting a child. "Everything okay?" she asked, then filled the silence with a litany of small complaints about schedules and who would pick up what. Her questions were performative, meant to bide time until someone else fixed the problem. Each terse message, each strained remark, built a quiet pressure. I began to catalog their reactions like an anthropologist studying a tribe I had always been part of, but never belonged to. Who called first? My aunt. Who escalated to yelling? My brother. Who tried to charm and deflect? My sister. Those patterns were revealing. They told me where the levers of influence lived in our family and who relied on my steadiness most. More importantly, they showed which relationships were conditional and which were permanent. The psychological tension wasn't explosive. It crept in, an accumulation of microaggressions and near misses that added up to something enormous. I replayed conversations in my head, analyzing tone and timing, noticing how quickly their irritation turned to anxiety when my help was no longer guaranteed. I felt oddly empowered by that observation. Understanding their dependency was like holding a map of the battlefield. I could see weak points and plan moves with intention rather than impulse. There were moments that felt almost cruel in their normalcy. A neighbor casually congratulated my sister on the Thanksgiving menu, as if nothing had happened. My sister smiled and returned the pleasantry, but then shot me a look that combined annoyance and calculation. My presence had become inconvenient. I had become a complication in plans that once ignored me. That twist, being inconvenient rather than invisible, felt like a small victory. It validated the idea that the balance had begun to tilt. My emotions were mixed. Satisfaction simmered under a layer of guilt I didn't expect to feel. There was a human cost to any upheaval. Still, the guilt was tempered by clarity. For years I had been absorbing their crises while they treated me like a background fact. Now, with that safety net removed, they were stumbling. Watching them flounder was not about joy in their failure. It was about watching a truth surface that had been hidden by habit. By the third day, the subtle ripples had turned into visible cracks. A message from my sister landed like a tally. Vendors not answering, deposits missing, a caterer backing out. Her tone was no longer performative anger but plain panic. I stared at the screen, feeling a complex mix of vindication and anxiety. The plan had moved beyond theory. I found myself considering the next move not out of malice, but to teach a lesson, a carefully measured disruption that would expose their entitlement and force accountability. Whatever I chose next would change Thanksgiving forever. No turning back. I started small because escalation felt childish and unnecessary. I wanted them to feel disoriented, not destroyed. My first move was the caterer. I had the receipts, the dates, the name, everything they needed to run a perfect Thanksgiving dinner. I called and explained that the deposit had been delayed and that I was transferring it myself, then made sure the transfer would arrive an hour after the scheduled delivery. Watching my sister's face when the food truck pulled away empty was a private kind of satisfaction, quiet and precise, like setting a clockwork piece into motion and listening for the tick. Next came the seating. I knew how my mother loved order, how she liked everyone sitting just so, with the favored child nearest the head of the table. I contacted the rental company for the chairs and told them to deliver the wrong set. Folding chairs instead of the elegant wooden ones my mother bragged about on Facebook. When the delivery driver unloaded cheap metal chairs onto their pristine lawn, everyone tried to laugh, to make a joke, but laughter had a brittle edge. My brother muttered about logistics and blamed the vendor while my sister ran in a flurry of phone calls that went nowhere. Then there were the name cards. I ordered custom place cards weeks in advance and had them shipped to my house by mistake. Their carefully curated seating chart suddenly had holes and scribbled replacements, and my mother clutched the crumpled list like a talisman. I watched her flip through it, her smile thinning. People notice small things, the slightly off centerpiece, the napkins in the wrong shade, until the accumulation of tiny failures became a pattern impossible to chalk up to coincidence. I made sure none of it felt catastrophic. There was a turkey, slightly late, but still edible. There were sides, though the gravy arrived lukewarm. The chaos was a slow drip, not a flood. That pace was intentional. Humiliation that could be blamed on circumstance, but that still pierced pride. My goal wasn't to ruin their lives. It was to puncture the balloon of their superiority, to show them that their comfort had been based on conveniences they took for granted. Watching from a distance, I felt a complicated satisfaction. My sister's smile kept wobbling. My brother's jokes had an edge that wasn't there before, Guess whispered, picking at the awkwardness with the cruel curiosity of bystanders. I read the room from the safety of anonymity, noting the shifts in tone, the micro-expressions, the way people angled away from my family members as if embarrassment were contagious. Still, as the day wore on, a small, unexpected thing happened that unsettled me. My cousin, always quiet, always overlooked, caught my eye and mouthed, "Thank you." He didn't know what I had done, and I didn't know if I wanted him to. His gratitude complicated the clean moral line I had tried to draw. Had I been selfish, or had I been right? The question crawled under my skin and stayed there. I told myself the disruption was a lesson. They needed to understand the fragility of the world they had built on other people's labor. But even lessons can bruise the innocent, and seeing helpers and vendors shuffle awkwardly as they tried to pick up the slack reminded me that my actions had consequences beyond the family drama. Still, the greater consequence, that my mother and siblings would have to feel a sliver of the instability they had subjected me to for years, felt necessary. By the time dessert arrived, the subtle ripples of sabotage had transformed into an unmistakable narrative. Something had gone wrong. The neighbors texted, the group chat filled with concerned messages, and my mother looked smaller than she had in years. Her posture collapsed by the weight of expectation gone awry. The humiliation was public but not humiliating in an irreparable way. It was a balancing act between exposure and teaching. As they tried to regroup, I felt the power shift settle into my chest like something warmed. The family that had once ignored me was now operating in my absence, and the absence, carefully engineered, spoke louder than any argument. I hadn't screamed or thrown dishes. I had simply removed the scaffolding. And that, I realized, was more disruptive than any tantrum. The game had changed, and for the first time in my life, I was playing by my own rules. I knew this was only the opening gambit. There were deeper moves to come, quieter but more consequential, and I sat with a steady calm, planning my next step as their confusion settled into panic and hope. After the small victories and the calculated chaos, I was left alone with a noise I couldn't drown out. My own thoughts. The adrenaline had faded and the quiet forced me to reckon with what I had started. Guilt rushed in first, a tight, surprising knot. I pictured the caterer on the phone, the rental driver apologizing to neighbors, the aunt scrambling to rearrange seating. Those faces made the plan feel less like justice and more like a ripple that reached people who hadn't asked to be part of my lesson. Memory threaded through the present. I thought of all the quiet labor I had poured into this family, the nights covering repairs, the holidays I organized, the times I lent money without expecting thanks. Those acts had been love, but also the scaffolding everyone leaned on. For so long I had been the backbone, and they had taken it for granted until my absence made them wobble. That recognition felt oddly vindicating and unbearably tender at once. Hope arrived, small and strategic. I began to imagine boundaries that weren't apologies in disguise, conversations where my contributions were named, where favors weren't automatic, where my presence wasn't something to be rearranged. That hope felt like a plan, less a fantasy, and more a possibility I could engineer with patience and resolve. It steadied me more than the thrill of disruption ever had. A cynical whisper pushed back. Apologies could come easy, casseroles could paper over consequences, and old rhythms could return if I didn't follow through. The fear of sliding back into the old role sharpened my intent. If this was to mean anything, it had to be part of a larger change, not a momentary spectacle. I wanted leverage that lasted, not theatrics that made a good story and then dissolved. There was an odd lesson in the discomfort. Power, when used well, reveals rather than destroys. By removing the conveniences I had provided, I exposed who truly cared and who performed care. The pattern was instructive. Some reached out with genuine concern, others with a demand to be fixed. That map of dependency felt like a tool. It told me where boundaries could be set and where support was conditional. Still, satisfaction sat next to a strange tenderness. I had acted, and that action shifted something fundamental. I was no longer the passive character in my family's narrative. That realization was intoxicating and humbling. Intoxicating because for the first time I saw myself as capable of change. Humbling because change often costs others in ways I hadn't fully considered. I resolved to be measured. My aim was accountability, not cruelty. I wanted to force recognition of my worth, not ruin livelihoods or relationships. The line between consequence and cruelty was thin, and I intended to walk it carefully. Teaching a lesson felt different from inflicting pain. It required foresight, boundaries, and a willingness to face the fallout. As texts grew more insistent and my family scrambled to patch holes, I felt a steadiness that hadn't been there before. The first move had landed, but the true test was how they would respond over time. I wasn't done, far from it. But for the first time I felt like I was steering my life instead of asking permission to exist in theirs. Then my phone buzzed again, and I read the name on the screen. It was my mother. Her voice would decide whether this was a lesson or a war. I swallowed and set my jaw, knowing the next conversation would test every boundary I'd just erected. Bring it on. My phone buzzed again, this time a single, persistent vibration that refused to be ignored. I knew before I answered whose name would appear. Mom. I braced myself and tapped the screen, hearing her voice almost immediately. It was a mix of desperation and irritation, like a storm that couldn't decide whether to rain or thunder. Why are you doing this? She demanded, words spilling faster than I could process. Do you have any idea what you're causing? This is selfish, ridiculous! She shifted seamlessly from pleading to accusing, like she expected tears or excuses, like she expected the old, obedient me to emerge. But I didn't crumble. I inhaled slowly, keeping my voice calm, steady, deliberate. I'm not doing anything you can't handle, I said. I've set boundaries. I'm not fixing everything for everyone this time. My words hung in the air between us, firm, but not cruel. She sputtered, trying to interrupt, but I didn't let her. Listen, I continued. I've spent years covering for everyone, putting myself last. That ends now. You hear me? I won't be the invisible one anymore. For the first time, she actually paused. There was a flicker of surprise, maybe even shock. She had always talked over me, dismissed me, assumed I would melt under her pressure. But now, my calm assertion created a space she hadn't navigated before. Silence stretched between us like a taut wire, charged with tension. I could hear her inhale, and for the first time she really listened. Her voice returned, quieter, more tentative, trying to negotiate, to guilt, to charm. I held my ground. I didn't yell. I didn't plead. I didn't soften. No, I'm not negotiating how I choose to participate in my own life, I said, voice steady. I'm done being treated as expendable. Every word reinforced the barrier I had built, the boundary I had never enforced before. I felt the emotional payoff ripple through me. Years of being ignored, overlooked, and dismissed culminated in this moment. She could speak, she could plead, she could beg, but she could not dictate my actions. For the first time, the conversation was mine as much as it was hers. It was raw, tense, and electric in its clarity. By the time we ended the call, I wasn't angry in the old reactive way. I was centered. I had taken back the space that had always been denied to me. The dramatic tension peaked, not with a scream or a slam, but with a quiet shift. The scales had tilted, and for the first time she had no choice but to hear me. And in that silence that followed, I felt a new kind of power, steady, resolute, undeniable. The next move required precision. I wasn't just going to disrupt Thanksgiving. I was going to create consequences that would demand attention, consequences that would force my family to reckon with the reality they had long ignored. I spent weeks quietly researching, consulting an attorney, and ensuring every step was legal, airtight, irreversible. By the time I was ready, I had redirected joint accounts and financial obligations so that their access depended entirely on my cooperation. Every utility, every shared subscription, even some minor investments, all rerouted. The process was meticulous, deliberate, and completely under my control. The moment I flipped the switch, I felt a rush of empowerment unlike anything I had experienced before. My siblings, who had always operated as if I were an invisible safety net, suddenly discovered they were exposed. The texts began immediately, my brother demanding answers, my sister accusing me of sabotage, my mother oscillating between panic and anger. Each message reinforced what I already knew. The balance of power had shifted. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't expendable. I wasn't the family's silent servant anymore. It was satisfying to watch the subtle panic take hold. Emails bounced back. Automatic payments failed. And suddenly, every responsibility they had relied on me for landed squarely on their shoulders. They called me, texted me, and even showed up in person, trying to cajole, plead, and guilt me into reversing my actions. But I remained steady, measured, refusing to fall into old patterns of compliance. Instead of reacting emotionally, I observed, calculated, and allowed them to feel the full weight of their dependency. There was a strange mix of emotions inside me. Glee tempered with restraint, satisfaction tempered with awareness. I wasn't acting out of malice. I was enforcing accountability. Years of being overlooked had left me hyper-aware of how easily my contributions had been taken for granted. Now finally, my family had to confront the very inconvenience they had caused me for decades. I reveled in the subtle social shifts. My siblings, friends, and spouses noticed the tension, the faltering routines, the sudden scramble to cover for bills that had once been automatic. My mother's confident, commanding tone wavered, replaced by sharp, clipped instructions and uncharacteristic self-doubt. I could feel the status tension crystallizing. Those who had once overshadowed me were now scrambling, while I watched from a position of quiet authority. The satisfaction wasn't just personal. It was moral and psychological. By exercising this leverage, I had demonstrated that boundaries have consequences, that neglect has a price, and that power, when withheld strategically, can force recognition. This wasn't revenge for its own sake. It was an assertion of worth, a reclamation of dignity that no amount of past dismissal could erase. As I monitored their responses, I felt a calm exhilaration. The roles had reversed. For the first time, I wasn't the powerless observer of family drama. I was the one who set the terms. And as I read the increasingly frantic texts and emails, I knew the lesson was landing. The game had changed. The scales had tipped, and there was no turning back. By the time the evening arrived, the subtle chaos had rippled beyond my family's inner circle. Neighbors and family friends began to notice the oddities, the missing chairs, the slightly late food delivery, the uneven table settings. Whispers floated across the lawn, casual questions that carried an edge of curiosity and judgment. "Didn't she organize this?" someone asked. "Something seems off." I watched from the periphery, feeling the quiet satisfaction of witnessing consequences without lifting a finger to actively embarrass anyone. It was justice served through their own neglect. My mother's composure, always her armor, began to crack in subtle ways. The way she adjusted napkins with a forced smile, the way her hands trembled slightly as she tried to manage the room. Each movement betrayed her discomfort. My siblings, too, fumbled through explanations, their usual confidence replaced by awkward gestures and half-formed excuses. They were publicly visible but powerless, and the tension was deliciously palpable. The friends' glances and murmurs amplified the embarrassment without me needing to intervene. It wasn't a cruel spectacle. It was a natural consequence of their own pride and assumptions. Every puzzled look, every whispered remark reinforced the reality my family had ignored for years. They could no longer take my labor, my patience, or my presence for granted. Karma, slow and deliberate, had arrived quietly but unmistakably. I felt a surge of emotional satisfaction watching them navigate the fallout. Their discomfort was a reflection of the imbalance they had created, a mirror to years of favoritism, dismissal, and public belittlement. They had constructed their own stage for humiliation, and I merely observed, letting events unfold. Amidst the tension, a part of me softened. This wasn't just about proving a point. It was about exposing the truth of our dynamics. By subtly orchestrating these disruptions, I had forced acknowledgement of my worth, and forced them to confront how often they had relied on me while pretending I didn't exist. As the evening wore on, I sat back quietly, savoring the contrasts, confident versus flustered, entitled versus accountable, ignored versus indispensable. For the first time in a long time, I felt fully seen. Not because I demanded it, but because I had engineered circumstances that revealed the truth in plain sight. Karma had arrived, and it was impeccably timed. The week after Thanksgiving felt like walking through a storm. Messages poured in, varying from frantic apologies to thinly veiled accusations. My brother texted, blaming vendors and trying to twist responsibility back onto me. My sister called multiple times, each conversation a careful mix of charm and subtle guilt-tripping, testing if I would revert to old patterns. Even my mother attempted the same, alternating between soft pleadings and sharp critiques. Every interaction was a test, a measure of whether I had truly shifted the balance of power. I responded with calm and restraint, no longer rushing to smooth over their mistakes or soothe their discomfort. Where before I might have apologized or explained, now I simply set clear boundaries. "I've done what I'm going to do. You'll need to handle this yourselves," I repeated, letting the words land without embellishment. The frustration in their voices only reinforced the reality I had been waiting for. They could no longer assume I would act as the safety net. Watching them stumble through logistics, miscommunications, and awkward encounters revealed patterns I had never consciously seen before. My perspective expanded. I could observe not just their reactions, but my own, the way I maintained control over my emotions, my time, and my energy. I felt a quiet pride in my ability to stay composed, to resist the pull of old guilt or obligation. Apologies came sporadically, some sincere, others performative. Manipulations were attempted, but I recognized each one immediately, countering not with anger, but with firm refusal. The week became a kind of laboratory for my emotional growth. Every interaction tested my resolve and reinforced the lessons I had already begun to internalize. By the end of the week, I realized how much had shifted. I was no longer the reactive, overlooked family member. I had become an observer with agency, someone who could choose engagement or detachment. The emotional growth wasn't flashy. It was a steady, powerful assertion of self-respect. And as I reflected on each interaction, I felt a calm satisfaction, knowing that the control I had gained was not temporary. It was a new way of being that even my family's panic and apologies could not undo. Amid all the tension and fallout, I received a message from my cousin, the one who had always been quietly overlooked, the one my family never seemed to notice unless it was convenient. He was struggling, caught up in the chaos of Thanksgiving disasters, and quietly asking for help. Normally, I might have ignored it, focused entirely on my own reclamation of power, but something shifted in me. I realized that my actions didn't have to be purely punitive. They could be strategic and principled. I stepped in, offering guidance and resources to fix a problem no one else had bothered to see. I helped him rearrange his finances, coordinated a last-minute dinner contribution, and offered support without fanfare or expectation of repayment. Watching him regain a small measure of stability reminded me that strength doesn't have to be selfish. It can be shared, extended, and still reinforce boundaries. The contrast was striking. While my mother and siblings scrambled in frustration over inconveniences I had created, I quietly empowered someone who had long been marginalized. It felt deeply satisfying, a moral high ground that balanced the chaos I had orchestrated. I could demonstrate that revenge wasn't about cruelty, but about asserting fairness, recognizing worth, and amplifying overlooked voices. In that moment, I saw the full spectrum of my influence. I could withhold, I could disrupt, and I could support. Each choice was deliberate, calculated, and aligned with my newfound clarity. Helping my cousin wasn't just kindness, it was a statement. While my family grappled with embarrassment and panic, I proved that empowerment could coexist with justice. By the end of the day, I felt a quiet warmth alongside my pride. The satisfaction of holding power had grown richer, more nuanced. Revenge and morality could coexist, and in exercising both, I realized that the story of my family was no longer theirs to dictate. It was mine to shape, with compassion and cunning in equal measure. Thanksgiving arrived, but this year it was unlike any I had known. No chaos, no frantic calls, no subtle manipulations. I sat alone in my apartment, a simple meal before me, and felt a peace that had been foreign for decades. The turkey was store-bought, the sides minimal, but the table was mine, arranged exactly how I wanted, with no judgment, no comparisons, no silent critiques. For the first time, I could eat without the weight of approval pressing down on me. I reflected on the weeks that had passed, the text, the missed calls, the financial leverage, the subtle chaos, and the moral victories. Each step had built toward this moment, this quiet assertion of self-worth. I realized that my satisfaction didn't need to come from external validation. It came from knowing I had set boundaries, reclaimed my agency, and acted according to my own principles. There was no bitterness in my thoughts. I didn't dwell on their failures or revel in their embarrassment. Instead, I celebrated the freedom that came with self-respect, the liberation of choosing my own path, the clarity of no longer bending to demands that had never served me. The solitude wasn't loneliness, it was empowerment. As I sipped my wine and nibbled at my simple plate, I felt a sense of completeness. I had been visible to myself, fully acknowledged my own worth, and no longer depended on recognition from those who had dismissed me. This Thanksgiving, I didn't just survive, I thrived in quiet dignity, and that, more than any approval or accolade, was the victory I had been seeking all along. As the day faded into evening, I leaned back in my chair and let my mind wander over the past weeks. The lessons I had enforced, the boundaries I had drawn, and the subtle chaos I had orchestrated all converged into a single, undeniable truth. The dynamics had shifted permanently. I could feel it in the quiet of my apartment, in the ease of my breathing, in the absence of guilt. Future interactions with my family would no longer be dictated by their whims or my old habits. I was in control now, and every choice I made would reflect that power. I thought about the inevitable calls, texts, and attempts to charm or manipulate me that would come. They might try, as always, but I would respond deliberately, on my own terms, with the calm authority I had cultivated. I realized that empowerment wasn't a moment, it was a practice, a continuous assertion of self-respect and boundaries. A sense of quiet pride washed over me. I had navigated anger, humiliation, and resentment without losing myself. I had exacted consequences without cruelty, and I had offered support without weakening my position. That balance, rare and hard-won, felt exhilarating. I smiled at the thought that my family's assumptions about who I was and what I would tolerate had been shattered. From now on, my presence, my help, and my attention would be conditional, earned, and acknowledged. I didn't need approval to feel whole, and that truth anchored me in a confidence that no text, call, or criticism could shake. The night closed around me, peaceful yet charged with possibility. I knew challenges would come, but I was ready. Thanksgiving had been a turning point, yes, but more importantly, it had been a declaration. My life, my choices, my terms. And in that declaration, I discovered an enduring, unshakable empowerment that would guide me long after the last dish was cleared.